Okay.
All right. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to see everyone is still surviving. So today we have the pleasure of someone well known to you, Rob Goldston, who needs no introduction, but he'll get one anyway. And, you know, on Wednesday, we had a lot of remarks about real Normalians. I'd say we have a real Princetonian here in that spirit. Rob entered PPL in 1972, I believe, and never left. And this is already an amazing scientific achievement, since it shows that, you know, your information can actually escape a black hole, and all these years. So, and during his time there, he sort of journeyed from the center outward, right? He began in PLT, and I guess Xavier's not here, so I may be the only one who knows what PLT is. Other than Rob, of course, and then moved to sort of the confinement region in the days of TFTR core physics, which I, by the way, enjoyed very much working with him during. And now he's at the scrape-off layer. And if this trend has predictive power, his next major work will be on plasma wall interaction. And along the way, he was director of PPPL, as I think all of you know. And now, maybe coincidentally, or maybe there's causality, he's working on nuclear disarmament and abolition of nuclear weapons. So that's what one may drive the other. And Rob is known, you know, for many scaling laws, all of which are pessimistic. And today he's going to discuss one of his more recent productions, which is appropriately named News from the Fringe. So with that, Rob, take it away.
If I made disarmament or nuclear disarmament, that's why you're chair.
Of course, you know, in the best traditions of US presidents, right?
Okay, I'll try to think about that. My wife says I work 75% time on fusion and 75% time on arms control and nonproliferation. I can confirm that I don't sleep very much, so maybe that's consistent. But I'm still very engaged in fusion stuff, and this is one of the two things that I'm working on a lot. I'm also interested in using lithium vapor as a way of mitigating the heat flux from fusion systems. But onto this. So this is News from the Fringe, and you may have heard of the heuristic drift model. I'll review what it is, and then I'll talk about a generalization of it to both very low and very high collisionalities. And when we did that, well, I'll get to a second, my co-authors. When we did that, we also decided to look at the implications of this. You could once you have an idea of what the temperature profile is outside the separatrix, you have an idea of what the potential profile is. Therefore, you have an idea what the shearing rate is. Let's say you could go, you know what the flow rate is, the E cross B flow rate, you know what the shearing rate is. And so we wandered through that and discovered that it looks like you've got an interesting prediction of where, right near the separatrix, in principle right outside the separatrix, since this model for the electric field only is valid along the field lines that connect to solid surfaces, you have a model for the shear flow, and it's in the right ballpark. In fact, it's sort of too good, actually, in terms of its possible causing a shear flow stabilization of scrape-off layer interchange turbulence, and that being a criterion for staying in the H mode. The H mode jumps into this regime with a narrow scrape-off layer that goes with the top part with the heuristic drift model, but as the density rises, you'll see it widens and the shear flow stabilization gets turned off. So this is work that I did with Andrew Brown, who was at Oxford at the time and is going to Imperial College. Hopefully he'll come back to the United States with Thomas Eichen with the Aztecs upgrade team. So here we are at the Festival de Théorie, And let's have some fun. Let's look at some new stuff. So let's start by looking at some old stuff, the heuristic drift scrape-off layer model. So the basic assumption of this original model that's been very successful, as I'll show you, but the basic assumption of this was that it was that the scrape-off width is given by some kind of E cross B or magnetic radial drifts times the parallel confinement time. So heat or particles stay in the scrape-off layer for some time before they're basically lost in the parallel direction. But during that time, how much do they move outwards due to the radial drift speed? So this is a very different model than the usual picture if you have a parallel confinement time and then you have a diffusion coefficient. And so now during that time you diffuse radially. So this is a flow rather than a diffusion. The model was developed for low gas puff conditions. Indeed, I believe the title of the paper is Low Gas Puff H-Mode Scrape-Off Layer Model or something like that. And so we were considering just a particular kind of condition. And this is the condition where you could measure the heat flux at the diverter target to pretty high accuracy. You have a lot of gas puffing, you get a lot of extra light. You even get IR if you go far enough, and then that could just completely mess up your ability to measure the heat flux at the target. So this was focused, all this work was low gas puff H modes. So originally, again, it was specifically low gas puff H mode, and it assumed that we had sheath-like losses from the soles, sort of sheath-limited-like losses from the sole, which gives you a parallel confinement time. If you say on average it's going out at half the sound speed, that is some parallel length divided by C sound over 2. And that's what you get from a sheath-like condition with the temperatures constant along the field line, and just it hits a target. So that's a very collisionless assumption. On the other hand, we also assumed that the upstream temperature was determined by the Spitzer-Harm thermal conductivity, with the target temperature to the 7/2 power, much less than the upstream temperature to the 7/2 power. So it's kind of a weird thing. We're saying that the target temperature isn't that much lower than the upstream temperature, but we're also saying that if you take it to the 7/2 power, it is much lower than the upstream temperature. So those are odd bedfellows, but they worked well for the experimental conditions, and I'll show you actually why in a broader consideration that they did work. And they were driven by this fact that high quality IR data, the choice of these conditions were that high quality IR data, particularly on tungsten, actually, as it turns out, in H mode is really only available under lower gas puff conditions. So that's where we started, and it worked pretty well. I mean, as plasma physics goes, here was a model with, I guess it had an overall adjustable parameter in that instead of being A over R times the poloidal gyro radius, the best fit is about 25% down from the straight off HD model. And, over a pretty wide range. And I guess there is newer data from CMOD that doesn't fit on this scale, that's somewhere down here at their very highest currents. And this whole thing is, plus or minus 25% gets you, I don't know, must be 80, 90% of the data points. So that's pretty encouraging. It's a very simple model. I mean, the whole expression is here. The only subtlety is the t to the 1/2 that's in here. You have to get through this self-consistent Spitzer-Harm thing. So in some sense, it's not even t to the 7/2 that has to be small, has to have a big difference between upstream and downstream. It's t to the 7th, right? Because you're taking this, you're only caring about t to the 1/2. And so the fit, obviously not bad. And indeed, the individual scalings are not bad. So here is the heuristic drift model scaling is on the left, whether it's 0 here, for various items, and compared to the magnetic field scaling or the Q scaling or the power scaling. When you throw in NSTX, it gets a little messy. NSTX has got a kind of a funny geometry with a very extreme triangularity. So that may be causing some difficulty, but basically very low power scaling, very low size scaling. And that's the part that is pretty astonishing and pretty problematic. everyone had always assumed that with a longer parallel confinement time, you would end up with a wider scrape-off layer. But not so, because with a larger major radius, the drifts are smaller, right? There's a 1/r in the drifts. And so the answer is that all cancels out, and you get just the poloidal gyro radius, as I showed you earlier, which only depends on the magnetic field, NQ. So the key practical result that is both within the experimental scalings and also in the heuristic drift model is that the scrape-off width does not vary explicitly with the system size. And so roughly speaking, it's time to take out a gun and shoot yourself, because this is not good. We have to go to higher fields. We thought maybe that would get mitigated by going to larger sizes, and no. Okay, but there is something interesting that was coming out early on, fairly early on. Actually, should have a date on this, but H.J. Sun, I don't think I can pronounce it right, so she sometimes gets called Sunny. Anyway, she saw
Rob, it's simply Hongjin Sun.
Hongjin.
Hongjin.
Okay, good, Hongjin. So Hongjin Sun did nice work, and she saw that as the separatrix density rose, the scrape-off width could like double. And she pointed this out, and this was the electron temperature. You see, we were using the target heat flux, and she started using, as she got the Thomson scattering system working on Aztec's upgrade, she started looking at the electron temperature gradient scale length. And so you can see it's sort of doubling as you go to higher collisionality. So the HD model, which says collisionality doesn't matter, right? They didn't see any collisionalities in 1.6 A/R rho colloidal. So it failed at high collisionality. So we have a problem. So let's generalize this heuristic drift model versus collisionality. And after a little bit of fooling around, it turned out that it actually is sort of intellectually simple and kind of pretty. According to Spitzer or Stangby or whatever you like, T to the 7/2 is what it varies linearly with the heat flux. And so it's really the upstream temperature minus the downstream temperature, each to the 7/2 power, that depends on the parallel heat flux and the distance you're going and the thermal conductivity. So then there's another condition that is the standard thing that is in these 2-point models, which is that the upstream power, parallel power density can get reduced by radiation on the way to the diverter. And typically this assumption, if you're going to hold on to this, you kind of have to assume that this radiated power is near the diverter plate. Although I've actually played other games with this, and it's not so it's a little insensitive to where the power is. But anyway, if you do a real numerical model. But anyway, Q parallel reduced by the radiated power fraction. So if this is 0.9, then it's only 10% of Q parallel that shows up at the diverter plate. And that has to be carried into the diverter by an energy density at an N target, T target, moving at a sound speed, so a T to 1/2 times the sound speed at 1 eV. And there's a gamma in front here, which is typically taken to be something like 7. So that's the usual boundary condition at the target. So we're doing this sort of standard stuff. The HD model did not include this T target though. So a key parameter that's surprisingly not in the literature is you can just write it down, that the tau E parallel, the parallel energy confinement time, that you might have thought there'd be a 3/2, but this has electrons plus ions. And now I've got upstream density and upstream temperature and a parallel length, because that's going to give me, the stored energy is held in some length, divided by Q parallel. So this is power per unit area, and this is energy per unit area. So, okay, that's a tau E. Tau E parallel. And that's not in the literature, but we want to calculate it. And you can, and I could give you 2 or 3 pages of algebra if you were in the mood, but I'm not in the mood. So let's just imagine I've turned the crank. And what you get is an enhancement over the sheath limited case, essentially over the original HD model. That is, you can see this tau e prime shows up twice. And so it's a, it's a little nonlinear equation. It's no big deal, but it has collisionality in it now. And so there's an enhancement over the HD model that has a collisionality in it. I think I define eta in a moment. And so here it is. Yeah, here we go. So this is the collisionality effect on tau e, and this is the higher density part. We haven't yet dealt with the low density part. So here is the collisionality effect on tau e, and this eta nu star here, where eta is this guy, and here's this function of z effective that is in the thermal conductivity. Surprisingly, there isn't a good fit in the literature, but this fits very well to the Spitzer thermal conductivity. And stick it in here, and then you've got a variation here. And this is the standard number that is used for nu star sol. These numbers aren't so different from unity, and so here you're seeing, sort of a factor of increase, kind of in the same area that Sun was seeing a factor of increase, factor of 2-ish increase. And what we have here is F power increasing. So here is F power equals 0, no radiated power at all in the scrape-off layer. And here's 100%. And this is the place where you get I think the collisionality effect is a 20%-ish increase. Now there's also the fact that, so this was the change in tau e. And so that is going to give you an increase, of course, in the drift speed times tau e. So that's, one of what you're interested in this model is drift speed times tau e. So here's the tau e enhancement. Well, there's also a drift speed enhancement that happens because the temperature is just higher. The T target thing is now non-zero. And so that changes the upstream temperature. And so that's a different piece. So it's the enhancement of the, if you like, gets, because of the way this works out, it's the drift speed divided by the parallel confinement time in C sound. But that parameter, that rho colloidal, gets increased by the fact just the temperature is higher. And so you end up with another one of these nonlinear equations. And you can see you get an enhancement to very low collisionalities. And these are super duper low collisionalities. You see you get a 10% effect. If there's no radiated power, if there's some radiated power, you're getting an 8% effect at really, really low collisionalities. These are very hard to access. So this may not be experimentally terribly relevant. There's a little bit of curvature here that plays in, but it's worth noting. And now you can just put the two together. So now you've got the enhancement in the drift speed and the enhancement in the time you get to drift. And you go to, and now this is n sept over n Greenwald for ASDEX upgrade like parameters, since I've been working a lot with ASDEX upgrade. This is the minimum point here along this curve. And again, more and more radiated power. And so first of all, you can see in the range of separatrix over Greenwald value where ASDEX upgrade operates at low gas puff. You have to push hard to get up here. The low gas puff range is sort of here. It's 0.5 is kind of really pushing it in ASDEX, and 0.1 is kind of unattainable. And so, this is the kind of range. And so kind of a little bit surprisingly, and, maybe, I don't know if it's a credit to my intuition or to my sleaziness, the original model in the range it was applied was pretty good. And it was sort of okay to do this assumption of how we got tau parallel and how we got and how we got the upstream temperature, even though they were sort of contradictory. They were kind of contradictory. So there we are. So up at the high end now, let's review the bidding. At the high end, we've got thermal resistance that increases tau e parallel because we're more collisional. And at the low end, we have sheath limiting where the T target gets to be finite and ultimately affects the upstream temperature and therefore the drift speed. So that's the picture here. And so now you have the generalized GHD model. And there was the HD model. And if you just put in 20% radiated power, which is right ballpark, you can see why this was sort of remarkably good. And the agreement with ASDEX upgrade data of this whole model. Now, what we've done here is taken that was a single flux tube that I was doing, single uniform flux tube calculation. And so what I've done here is come up with some way of radially averaging the collisionality, because remember the x-axis was the collisionality. So this is a new eta, where this was the old eta that you've seen before. And if you weight the radius with Q parallel, now you could have weighted the radius with stored energy, you could have weighted the radius with temperature, I don't know. But we did rate it in this case with Q parallel. And then you got a little factor difference, you got a factor here that actually generally increases the collisionality for typical lambda t's and lambda n's. And so, but nonetheless, here are the H modes, which have attended, the blue ones are the H modes on ASDEX. And this is that factor of 1.25 that was the best fit to lambda QHD. Experimental, which you can see is doing pretty well. Again, if you take 20% radiated power, you go right through the middle of this. And then you can see this thing curves upwards and the H modes are curving upwards. Maybe the collisionality isn't quite right. And then the L modes also seem, and so these are L modes here. Here are I modes for those that love I modes. Here are L modes, and it seems like the L modes, it's important to realize the L modes, even at the same collisionality, are wider than the H modes. I mean, this is just, I'm not predicting L mode scrape-off layer widths, but it does seem that you can't be lower than the classical prediction. Even the L modes, even at very, very high collisionalities, you can't, it isn't that this thing moves over like this. It really is kind of being dragged up by this line, it looks like. And so the L modes sort of have to be at least as wide as the GHD prediction seems. That's what you would take from this.
Have you, if I may interrupt,
Sure.
Have you explored anything? I mean, presumably your wonderful friends have a database with measurements of scrape-off layer turbulence, which you're about to get to. But I mean, for L mode, have they tried to organize the data on the ratio of the RMS turbulent velocity to the drift velocity? In other words, when one is much larger than the other, one would expect a much broader scrape-off layer. When it's comparable, then maybe the HD would work in L mode, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I don't think of it, it's not quite the RMS velocity, I guess.
Right. Well, some indicator of turbulent scattering that would broaden the layer. But I mean, as a first crack, I'd go with the, in the end, you have what's in the transport, right? There's the radial velocity and the tau parallel, and it's basically the transit time for the tau parallel. So, I mean, as an experimentalist type of crack, try to organize it in terms of that ratio.
Well, but, okay, I have to think about it, but the RMS drift is sort of canceling itself. So don't you have to think about some kind of a net flux or something?
Well, I mean, but I'm just saying, I'm thinking of the net flux as the V twiddle squared with the correlation time, and that correlation time can be set, well, by shearing, it can be set by parallel transit, et cetera. So that's why I think of RMS.
I see. Okay, well, we should talk some more, but I think to zeroth order, their detailed measurements in the scrape-off layer are very limited at ASDEX of turbulence. One of the things actually we're looking at is trying to get probe measurements of the turbulence characteristics.
Well, I mean, that's essential. And if you want to make the case for the tail wagging the dog, you need that, right?
Right, and then indeed that's the thing we're working on. There is the problem that, well, actually I'll make a little comment about that when we get to the database plot of the time average data, if you like. But there is a region where maybe we can get measurements into the scrape-off, well into the scrape-off layer. So onto the implications of shear flow, implications of this, of what we've talked about. So you now have a generalized HD model for the scrape-off layer that doesn't do too badly, I guess. And now we want to look at the implications of picking up this extra piece at high density. We want to look at the implications for shear flow of this, what we just heard, for shear flow stabilization of scrape-off layer interchange turbulence. So this is a simple thing to think about, and I guess Pat's done some more work on it. I'm looking forward to seeing, some preprints or what have you, Pat and his group. But so the shearing rate is the radial gradient of the E cross B drift. So that's phi double prime over BT in the scrape-off layer is what we're talking about here. You can also talk about inside, and since the P prime tends to sort of be constant across the separatrix, I think because the HD physics crosses the separatrix, I think you can sort of apply this inside the separatrix, and there you also get a shearing rate that when we calculate it is similar to outside the separatrix, but the reverse direction. But anyway, let's look at just outside the separatrix. And then there's an interchange growth rate, and this is the world's simplest interchange growth rate, but there it is. And so we can look at the competition between these two. So one thing to comment on is that the simulations with the GBS code by Halpern and Ricky.
Richie.
Is it Richie or Ricky?
Richie.
Yeah, I can never get which way it is with two C's versus one C. Oh, so two C's is with the chest type sound. Okay, so Richie, Halpern and Richie did this nice work where they were doing, with this GBS code, they were doing simulations of inner wall limited plasmas. And they did see a narrow region in what's called the near scrape-off layer, where the dark line is the E cross B shearing rate. And if you look at that equation, you could never figure that out. It just takes forever to sort through all the definitions of the units, but yes, it is the shearing rate. And then the other is what they call the ballooning growth rate, but it is actually just exactly what's normally called, or what other people anyway call, the interchange growth rate. And lo and behold, you're getting shearing rates that are large compared to the interchange growth rate in this inner region. And in that inner region, they're getting very narrow lambda Qs out of the calculation, but also out of the experimental data from TCV. So it's kind of encouraging to the general idea, and since this is before I published the GHD stuff, I wanted to be sure to give them credit, that maybe there's something important going on here. They talk about it changing the character of the turbulence, but they don't talk about it being that's the region where you would get the HD type scrape off with. But we're going to hypothesize that to get the H mode and to get the GHD, and therefore to get the GHD type scrape off with, requires the shearing rate of order, and we'll talk about what the number in front is, the interchange growth rate in the soul. So maybe what's going on here is that the way that the H mode gets triggered and sustained at high density, at least, is from a shearing rate near the edge being high enough to clip the toenails of any turbulence that wants to grow up in the core. And so that turns off the turbulence just across the scrape of the separatrix, and which then permits a steeper gradient inside there and the whole build up into the H mode. Or at least that's the hypothesis. And I'm not going to claim we've proven it, but we have tried to disprove it without success. So here is this TCV near scrape off layer data. And here is so this is the near scrape off layer. It sort of comes down sharply and then gets broader. And this sharp part seems to correlate with where at least theoretically, the shearing rate is large compared to the interchange growth rate. And here's some TCV data. And they're sort of scattered along this line. I mean, they're not everywhere the same. And this is broader, not plus or minus 25%. But here is the 8 milli, this is the 20% down, 25% down line, I guess 20% down, 25% up line that gives you the HD model, and it seems like it's in the ballpark of the HD model. So these near scrape-off layer lambda Qs for these inner wall limited plasmas look like the HD model, and they're also the range where the shearing rate is exceeding the growth rate. So I gave this talk, and Sergei Krashenikov was at this talk. I guess I don't remember exactly which meeting it was. Maybe it was an ITPA meeting, and he's just giving me hell that my model for the interchange growth rate is way too simple, blah, 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 which, fair enough. It was a very simple model. I got it out of a graduate student lecture that I found online by Roscoe. Also I must have learned it myself in those days. But anyway, here's gamma over gamma interchange. And this is the radial mode width from a calculation that Sergei sent me to, and that was from 2019. And so what they found was that as you increase the shearing rate compared to the interchange growth rate, you get the interchange modes, instead of being nicely radially aligned, are getting twisted up to quite significantly. And indeed, what they say in the next paper is that and actually I don't think they say it in the paper. I think it came from a private conversation. I said, so what happens at 0.5? And they said there is no eigenmode. The eigenmode disappears if you go beyond here. This is as far as they could push the code. It couldn't find an eigenmode. And maybe Pat's done some more work. And I'm not sure I would get married to this number 0.4. But it does suggest that a shearing rate over an interchange growth rate greater than some number of order unity is could be turning off this, could indeed would be the right place to be expecting the scrape off layer to go quiet. And indeed, that's what we bloody see. Now, this is experimental data. I'm going to have to take you for a tour of it, of how we got it and what we mean by it. But the x-axis, I think you're comfortable with, it's time. And the colors you're comfortable with, we've got L modes, we've got high density disruptions, and we've got H modes. And then what about the shearing rate versus the interchange growth rate? How did we get that? Well, so we got that from a 2-point model ansatz for the upstream potential that comes from Stangbye and Chenkin in 1996, and it's fairly simple. You get a potential that let's ignore all this stuff for the moment, which would be to say take upstream temperature equal to target temperature, so that you were in a purely sheath limited condition. Well, here's that the potential is jumping by 3T over E, and then the gradient scale length. So this is essentially the expected E cross B. Well, let's see, with one lambda T, it's the expected E cross B flow rate, and with another lambda T, it's the shearing rate. So that's what this part is, but there's also, if you have a finite difference between the upstream and the target temperature, there's a profile of the potential along a field line, and it depends, not too strongly, but it does depend on this difference. And so you have to take that into account. And for an ansatz, they were assuming that the density goes like a power of the temperature, the negative power of the temperature. So as the temperature drops, the density increases. And then you get T target. So that's one thing. So this is an ansatz by Stangbye and Chenkin, and you can argue with it. It assumes no parallel current, which is probably wrong way here at the low end. It might explain this one data point here. Also, it might be that these L modes, this is in the region where the H mode power threshold rises as the density drops, this particular point. So there may be something going on differently in this region, either in the model or in the physics. But anyway, you also need the target temperature, obviously, and you get again from the two-point model using the upstream Thompson scattering data. So this is poor for very low density. Maybe it's because of this J parallel. So anyway, but this is a reasonable model. And if you just do 3T, you know, it turns out it's not so bad. But anyway, it's a reasonable model. It's not going to be off by a factor of 2 on the shearing rate, I don't believe. And where do we get the interchange growth rate? Well, that's easy. We've got the pressure gradient. We've got and so we can just do it from the upstream Thompson scattering data. So one thing that's qualitatively interesting about this, and it's the way it sort of feels when you're running a machine, is that when you get into the H mode, it snaps into the H mode and it locks in. And I think what's happening, at least what this model would say is happening, is that you get enough shearing rate. You can see actually, you know, the shearing rate's growing. Be nice to have better data in this time period, but the shearing rate over the growth rate is growing. You get to some point, it quiets the turbulence, and now what happens is dramatically narrowing of the scrape-off layer. What happens in the L mode to the H mode transition is a strong narrowing of the scrape-off layer. It's one of the things that happens. And that narrowing of the scrape-off layer really has a big effect because of this lambda t squared. So it sort of locks in, and now you're really shearing it to bits. You started shearing it to bits, and boom, you turn down the turbulence, and now you're shearing it to bits ferociously. Anyway, so that's that. And then as the density goes up, one of the things one observes is the confinement tends to degrade, and you sort of slowly get worse and worse confinement, and then boom, you drop out of the H mode. And you know, if you take Zhang, Krasheninnikov, and Smolyakov seriously, it's not a bad line. I mean, again, I don't think you want to take this too seriously. This could be a coincidence, but at least we're in the general ballpark of the right physics, or at least the physics we're assuming is in the general ballpark of what the data say. Maybe the right thing to say. Now, it turns out that this.
Let me bug you with a question here. I mean,
Sure.
is there in any sense a gap or a lag between the onset, as the density is rising, the onset of linear instability? I mean, that calculation is just trivial, right? It's a linear shearing and interchange. Back to the Taylor-Goldstein equations, older than I am. So, I mean, is there a gap between the onset of linear instability and the HDL? And what I'm driving at is, does it take you, one expects it's not just simply linear instability that's in the game here, but there'd be some issue of penetrating the barrier at the separatrix.
So that's an interesting question, and I think Lothar works on that pretty hard. At ASDEX, these data are from Thompson scattering. We're trying to get, Thomas is trying to see if he could get a faster time resolution, but to get adequate Thompson data, he's averaging over he's averaging over 300 milliseconds, slicing out the Elm times. And so, you know, you're not going to get the time resolution of what you're looking for out of this. Probes is where I think where your best shot is.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Lothar has his hands up. Speaking of the devil.
Okay. I kept speaking of him. You have to hear him eventually.
Just a quick comment here. When you look at the actual fluctuation suppression, how this occurs in time, that seems to be more pronounced inside the last closed flux surface. So in other words, the increment in n twiddle over n goes down a lot more inside than outside initially, right? I mean, then now most of what I have looked at is at low density. So I haven't looked really at very high density cases. So that is still outstanding. But the scraper flare increment follows that. There's some delay, and it's also not as pronounced. It's not as pronounced, right? So
I sort of can't make a good argument about this side, frankly, in the causality sense, because I don't, at least in the GHD sense, because I don't have a GHD prediction for this. I do have a GHD prediction for this, but
Right,
in this, but if it's in the L mode, I haven't got a prediction, and so it's harder to say.
Yeah.
But it would be very interesting to look at these. By the way, these are lower power ones, quite low power ones. That is, the density goes up, fall out of the H mode earlier, and then these are higher power ones that hang in there for longer as the density goes up. Okay, so there was another question. Looks like Guillaume has a question.
Yeah, on the previous plot you were showing, just a quick one. You say it snaps in, but if you believe the Mons story, which you're probably familiar with, switching from interchange to drift wave, I was curious about, where would an I mode lie on that plot of yours? Would you still have the thing snapping in very abruptly, or the I mode would lie in between? And
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. We have there. I don't have. I haven't seen time dependent, and I don't have my own personal experience with I modes, but I haven't seen time dependent data from ASDEX in this way looked at for I modes. So I can't really speak to that. And there are different things going on in Mons's stuff, and I think at this end, it's when he does it, he is. I think the dominant term is the shearing rate just inside the separatrix versus already being in the interchange dominated regime. I need to study that more. I need to understand that better.
But without turning this into a referendum on Mons, how the hell do you justify the use of interchange inside the separatrix?
I guess there's an argument isn't there an argument that drift waves in interchange modes or resisted ballooning modes, or however you want to put it, are trading off against each other?
Oh yeah, no, I think
Roger, Drake, and Seiler.
Maybe I'm too much of a theoretical purist. I mean, interchange, it's not an interchange though. It would have to be something like a resistive ballooning, which is a more delicate beast.
Right. Yes, I think it is. I think it is.
That's in the level of delicacy and sensitivity of the theory, you go up a lot when you go from a simple interchange to resistive ballooning. And the effective curvature changes as you cross the boundary there. So, really,
I would have thought curvature is always, bad curvature is always bad curvature.
It is, but I mean, if you're on closed flux surfaces, you're forced to sample more of it, right?
Fair enough. Absolutely, certainly, and the shearing of the twistiness of the field lines matter and a lot of stuff. Right. It doesn't matter if you're just tied to a piece of metal. Okay, so so I'd love to ignite a discussion about the Mons thing, and one of the things that's on my list is to look at his high density theory versus this theory and see which seem to give results that are pretty similar. They may have a different magnetic field scaling. Seems to be this is a useful place to look at it. They may have a different magnetic field scaling, which might be a way to get a handle on it. Anyway, but here we are. Here is this. Has anybody ever looked at this problem before, you might ask? And the answer would be yes. Matthias Bernhardt did a nice set of studies as part of his PhD on ASDEX, and he actually did the work. He looked at the threshold in density versus Q, PSEP, and BT. But since the way I like to look at it is differently, if you have a scaling law for this, you can turn it into a scaling law for power as a function of the other things. So I'm framing it this way, but it's completely mathematically equivalent. So he had what they call the H5 density, which sort of skims along the top of the plasma on ASDEX and goes in deeply enough that it's really measuring largely the pedestal density, not so much the separatrix density. So that's a big caveat. But if you look at his prediction his measurement for the scaling of power versus density, it's density to the 2.5, but is this slightly funny H5 thing, which is more of the pedestal than the separatrix, to be clear. So this is a sort of a misnomer for that, I'm trying to emphasize. The GHD model is fairly similar for how for the power required to get the to sustain the shearing rate, right? That's the idea here. How much power does it take? That's the scaling of the power as the density goes up is more or less like n squared. If I double the density of the separatrix, I need 4 times more power to keep the shearing rate up above the interchange growth rate. Q cylindrical here. Curiously, they both have a negative b-toroidal scaling, which is a little counterintuitive, but Q, of course, has a b-toroidal in the numerator. So if you broke this into IP and BT, you'd have a positive BT scaling. But in any event, these are not so different. And this really wouldn't be the same thing because of this H5 thing. But the GHD captures the general trends, including this negative power scaling with BT. And so here it is. This is the separatrix power, the power that we calculate to be crossing the separatrix, taking away radiated power in the core, and the separatrix density versus, well, with various kind of plasmas on it. Notice it's a fairly narrow range in current. I mean, the current is really within 10 or 20 kiloamps constant, and the magnetic field is pretty constant. ASDEX does not. Sort of reminds me of the old days on PLT where we had a standard discharge we just kept staring at. They have a little bit of a constant condition. At least they can vary the separatrix density significantly, and they do. And what you see is nice H modes that get up to some kind of a density limit and then fall out and end up, they're too high density for the L mode to sustain them. And so they disrupt. So they fall into the L mode and then they disrupt. And then here are some L modes at much lower power. See, this is less than a megawatt of heating power. This is up to 10 megawatts of separatrix power. So here we are at 1 megawatt of separatrix power, even less. And you can see there are some H modes down here. But then there's a place where you run into trouble and now you start getting disrupted. First you fall out of the H mode, and now you can have L modes up here, but eventually they will disrupt. And so that's giving you some sense of the shape of this law. Now this would be omega s over gamma ant equals 1, and here we are with the Krasheninnikov formula. And there are factors of order unity in this whole story, so I wouldn't, I'd be a little cautious, but it's got the right sort of feel to it. Another interesting thing is that confinement improves as the shearing rate goes up. Over the interchange growth rate goes up. And it's as if, just spinning the thing at the edge continually kind of improves the conditions for the core, if you think in this tail wags dog kind of picture. So here is a case where we're moving along. These are time history traces, I think 3 different colors. There's a blue and a red and a black. But here we're going to track along the red one. So here it is going up in confinement. This is H98Y2. It'd be better to have some sort of pedestal confinement parameter, but we couldn't come up with one that was, I don't know how the right way to put it, that was reproducible kind of. But anyway, so you get up to pretty good for ASDEX anyway, 1.2 times H mode, and this is happening at 2 or 3 at shearing rate over interchange growth rate of sort of 2 or 3, and you actually came up pretty nicely, but on the other hand, confinement degrades on the way down as we go back down in omega s over gamma int. So this was the very rapid initial transition. And it really did very nicely. But then as you raise the density and you lower omega s over gamma int, you lower confinement, and then ultimately you fall out of the H mode to the back transition. Now, another thing that we ought to consider is Brunner and Silvani, both of whom kind of came to the conclusion that when you have better confinement, you have a narrower scrape-off layer. And sure, more stored energy, narrower scrape-off layer was where Brunner was coming from. And Silvani has a little bit more sophisticated argument, but basically better confinement, narrower scrape-off layer. So, you know, it's really that's the core transport that's affecting the edge. Well, or the other way around, right? It could be the tails wagging the dog, that yeah, you get better confinement when you have a gigantic shearing right at the edge that tears apart any turbulence that dares to stick its toe across. So I don't know.
Do either of these gentlemen accompany their claims with fluctuation measurements?
I know Brunner doesn't. I'd have to think about Silvani. I think not either. I think not. So let's go ahead and see what, you know, we just paid fill in the blank billions of dollars for ITER, and we're still paying. And so, so, you know, what are the implications for ITER? Well, one thing that's interesting is I showed you that ASDEX on a good day gets to 10 megawatts. So for some reason we have 5, 10, and 20, but we're not going to get 20 megawatts of separatrix power in ASDEX. So it's this middle curve here that is the relevant one. And the middle, so this is the shearing rate. And as you see, as you go up in density, the GHD model, this is based on the GHD model where you get widening at higher collisionality because the heat stays in the scrape-off layer for longer. So here we are with the shearing rate dropping pretty precipitously. You know, there's a log scale here, right? So the shearing rate is dropping pretty precipitously. It has a lambda t squared in it as we go up in density, or lambda q squared in it as we go up. Actually, it's a lambda t squared as we go up in density. And so if you wanted to be 2 or 3 times the interchange growth rate, which is more smoothly, you know, has much less variation, you would need to be, you know, somewhere between, say, 0.4 and 0.5 times Greenwald. Now, on the other hand, if you go to ITER and you ask for and 50 megawatts, actually, you know, 50 megawatts is only a third of the core heating power. And so maybe this is even conservative. You know, you're never gonna get to 20 cost in the separatrix in ASDEX. And maybe it's 50 in some of the simulations, they assume 50 going to the outer leg, but there's, you know, there's power going to the inner leg too. And that counts its P separatrix here. So this is maybe conservative. So, you know, but here, if you want a factor of 2 or 3 between this guy and this guy, you can go up not to 0.45, but to 0.7 on N over N Greenwald and still have this nice omega S over gamma int where you got the highest confinement. So that would be nice. It would be nice to be able to get up to 0.7 Greenwald. First of all, that's good for fusion power production, but it's also really good for achieving radiative detachment. The win on radiative detachment goes like density squared for more or less obvious reasons. That, you know, radiation is NE times the electron density times the impurities that are going to radiate, for example. And so it's an N squared effect. So, you know, interesting 0.45 and 0.7 squared is, you know, worth having. So that would be, you know, this is in contrast to every other prediction I've ever made in my entire career. This is positive. So, you know, possibly I'm losing my touch. Anyway, so, and also, so, you know, go back to this story. Well, the shearing rate is coming down. I guess it's this guy. The shearing rate's coming down at 0.7. So that means that the lambda t squared must be getting wider, and it is. So at very low powers, it's really collisional, and so you get an enhancement over the simple HD model. The GHD model enhances over the HD model by like a factor of 12, which would be nice, but I don't think we're going to get that. But at the 50 megawatt case we were talking about, it's more than a factor of 2. And that also is a win for detachment, because now you've got twice the volume to do the radiation in. Instead of a 1 millimeter scrape-off layer, a 2 millimeter scrape-off layer is still narrow, but 2 things are nice about it. One is that, pardon me, one is that you've got more volume to radiate, and the other is that if you don't radiate, you've got less intense heat flux to the target. So this is, it could be viewed as Rob recanting from his previously very pessimistic projections. I don't think this is the same, by the way, as the effects that C.S. Chang sees. I bug him about this, and you know, I ask him, what about collisionality? What is the collisionality in your cases? And he doesn't think that this is what's going on, let's say. Okay, so the conclusions, this HD model, the original HD model, can be generalized in a formally more, in a more formal sense, to lower and higher collisionalities. At high collisionality, it predicts lambda q is going to grow, sort of like the experiment, and maybe sets a lower limit to the scrape-off width. Aztec's upgrade data shows a strong correlation, anyway, of omega s over gamma int with H versus L mode. And it's consistent with the theory for scrape-off layer interchange stabilization. The GHD model predicts PSEP versus NSEP for the HL transition. So that's that plot with PSEP on the left-hand axis and NSEP along the x-axis, and showing that the HL transition occurs more or less like n squared, and in absolute magnitude like Aztec's. It's also the case that it looks like higher shearing rate compared to interchange growth rate goes with good confinement. The model predicts a high shearing rate over interchange growth rate. Probably ought to come up with some parameter for this, so I don't have to say it over and over. At high separatrix over Greenwald density for ITER. So that's encouraging. It suggests that ITER can sustain a good H mode at higher separatrix density. And it also moderately widens. Maybe I should be more positive than that. A factor of 2 is definitely worth having, you know, going from 25 megawatts per meter squared to 12.5 megawatts per meter squared is like going from the diverter will fail to the diverter will be challenged. There's more work to be done to validate the model. In particular, I think probe work at these high density cases is interesting. Oh, let me go back actually to this plot. So these guys are maybe the most possible to do probe work at, because you've got modest powers, you know, whatever this is, 600 kilowatts crossing the separatrix. So the edge plasma density is relatively modest. The heat flux is relatively modest. The temperatures are relatively modest. You know, maybe you can dare to drive a probe right up to the separatrix or even through it in these conditions, and where the Aztecs guys are warming themselves up to do that. So it's not so much this side, the low density side, that when you come into the H mode, that at least I'm most interested in. It's this side over here. I think the turbulence has a different character at very low density. It's something different. And maybe there it is maybe at very low density. That would be the arbitrarily most complicated solution, wouldn't it? Maybe the dog wags the tail at the lowest densities and the tail wags the dog at the highest densities. I don't know. Okay, so that was the thing I wanted to emphasize here, that we need to do more work. There's also this work by Ike and Mans, where Mans is looking at various mechanisms of stabilizing turbulence or reducing turbulence inside the last closed flux surface, just inside the last closed flux surface. I think at the high density end, the dominant thing is assuming that the ions are electrostatically confined, so that grad P corresponds to the flow speed, right, of the ions. You know, the J ion cross B is balancing grad PI. Which is what's often seen in the H mode, although I don't know about right at the separatrix and so on. But anyway, that's what they're assuming, and that model has the interesting feature that it has the collisionality effect dependence that we see from the GHD model, but it comes in sort of through the back door, in that when they plot the theory versus the experiment is widening at high density, and that's what we see, and that's what the GHD model predicts. And then Mont says, oh, look at that, the shearing rate is going down. And I think that's the dominant term. He's got 3 terms, and I haven't dug it apart. I haven't teased them apart enough. But I think he may be seeing the grad PI term, and therefore the shearing just inside the last closed flux surface going down. So it's also possible, I mean, it's obviously possible that the GHD model is pretty good for what the scrape-off layer turbulence looks like. I'm sorry, what the scrape-off width looks like. And then that's just, it also governs the pressure gradient just inside. And, you know, maybe that's a different way in which this physics is giving rise to the H mode. So that's what I have to offer. And I think there's a bunch of interesting stuff to sort out here. There's obviously more to be done. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. Let's give him a virtual applause and questions, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, looks like we got a few.
No, those are people clapping for
Oh,
you.
those are people clapping. Okay.
I mean, all right, we have a hand up. Guillaume.
Coming back to one of your early remarks that your initial model seems to work well, except for an STX, which is funny. It's your home machine.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in the Bible. It says you can't be a prophet in your own village, right?
Okay. But you were seemingly advertising geometry there. That's where I'm driving at. And
actually, have you lost? Can you see the screen? Probably not. I think I've unshared it.
No. So
Okay.
the question is, do you understand this geometry dependence? Do you have ways of capturing it? And have you tried your new model also with distinct geometry? And just to, well, and of course I'm going to be headed towards, you know, triangularity and possibly negative triangularity. So how would your scrape-off decay width fare in those configurations?
Great questions. First of all, the story on NSTX is kind of a mess because they did experiments that were low triangularity, top and bottom, if I remember right, at low power. And then as they went to higher power, for stability, they needed more triangularity. And so there's a correlation of power and triangularity in this data, which are confusing. And in general, the high power, high triangularity points are way, way higher triangularity than anybody else. And so that's just messy. So I put that in the category of messy. Mm-hmm. Now then, there's another category, which is what about triangularity? And if you go back to my original paper, I do indeed have an argument that says that you expect I'll have to think it through, 1 plus delta over 1 minus delta, a variation of the scrape-off width, essentially because the grad B drifts are, you know, if you have a vertical flux surface, the grad B drifts are not across the flux surface, they're along the flux surface. Now, in that paper, I point out, and I did sort of say at the beginning of this, that the E cross B drifts give you basically the same scaling. I think there's a difference in aspect ratio actually, but which, you know, maybe is a thing here, but they both give that, but other than the aspect ratio, you get the same result as the HD model or the GHD model. And I think the same scaling and so forth. Yeah, the same scaling. You'd get the GHD model would just carry through if it were the E cross B drift that mattered. Mm-hmm. So that all said, what you predict is that on the side of the plasma that's dead vertical, if you have a double null, I mean, it's a little hard to speak to a single null, but if you have a double null plasma, you would expect the scrape-off layer to be narrower on the side that was vertical. And actually, I encourage people to do those experiments. I tried to get D3D to do reverse triangularity experiments 5 years ago, and they didn't want to do that. But they've now done it, obviously. And there seems to be some difference of opinion as to whether the scrape-off layer is narrower or wider on when the outer flux surface is vertical, and also on D3D there are cases that are really that are single null, which is sort of, you know, I'm not quite sure how to make a prediction about a single null.
And
So I'd love to know if people really, if the TCV results are really conclusive, what the answer is on the scrape off width. I think I heard that it was wider, but I've heard on D3D that it's narrower.
okay. Given what you just said earlier, is it reasonable to think that switching negative and positive triangularities, that would help you sort out whether the magnetic drift or the E cross B is the relevant one, because they would probably predict different scalings in the end, right? Or
well, they would the grad B drift term, what do I want to say? The E cross B drift is not going to see triangularity as strongly as the grad B drift, because it's strictly radial, right? It's the poloidal electric field crossed with the toroidal. What is it? It's the poloidal electric field crossed with the toroidal magnetic field that causes the radial motion, and so that poloidal electric field is within a flux surface, and so it's strictly radial. Whether the grad B drift is crossing field lines or not, or crossing flux surfaces or not, the grad B drift really cares what the triangularity is, or, you know, the curvature drift, but the E cross B drift doesn't, because it's formally radial, and so it would within the framework of this model anyway, which you can argue with, but within the framework of the model, the E cross B drift would be would be less sensitive, I think, to triangularity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, let me return to a question I've asked you before. I mean, have you thought about the possibility of, if the pedestal was turbulent, and then, I mean, I think it's hard to argue if the pedestal was turbulent, and there are plenty of pedestal modes that are turbulent these days, that you might get spillover or spreading into the soul and broaden the soul, but it's a how much kind of question, right? And have you thought about that at all, or have any?
I certainly think, you know, if you go back to this picture, I certainly think that in the L mode, whatever's going on in the main plasma is messing with what's going on in the scrape-off layer. You know, if you look at the same collisionality, the H modes are just way narrower than the L modes, and so it's not the GHD physics that is right. That is the difference between H modes and L modes in the sort of, you know, these collisionality ranges here. So it's so I personally think. Want to have another caveat. I personally think that it's turbulence in the core, or it's turbulence, let's say, I guess I don't necessarily say it's in the core. There's turbulence is what's giving us this scrape off width. I think it could be that there's a minimum scrape off width, and, you know, Rozhansky got something like this actually. He has, and it's another thing I need to dig into. Rozhansky wrote a paper where he got numbers similar to the HD model for the scrape off width, but he had some funny square root of collisionality in there that I didn't really understand at the time. But it might be that he's looking in this region where it's not linear in collisionality, and it's not independent of collisionality, but with a little increase due to the edge temperature. But it's somewhere in between. And so and he got that straight out of just turning down the transport in the drift enabled version of Sulpius. And so it could be that you know, you just can't, you know, you're not going to do better than classical. And it could be that this sort of GHD model is classical, and that's what's up. And I'm not sure that's what you were getting at now that.
No,
I mean, I got off on a hobby horse, but maybe you had a different horse.
No, I mean, it is in the direction I'm getting at. The question is, in L mode, I think it would be pretty incontrovertible what I'm getting at. The question is, in H mode, you wonder that, in the effort to mitigate elms, right, that there are these class of H mode operations where you effectively, by one hook or another, induce the pedestal to host some turbulence. And I mean, you could go down the list of maybe certain grassy elms, maybe D3D's wide pedestal QH mode, and there's a few others going around.
Well, the Aztecs guys are gung-ho on a QE mode or something. I forget what they call it now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a zillion, but the question becomes, how much turbulence do you need in the pedestal to broaden the scrape-off layer? And I'm wondering if you had a thought on that.
But it's certainly if you make, macroscopic scale MHD activity, these quasi-coherent modes or whatever, that you can see them on the Mirnov coils and so on. That apparently is enough. And similarly on Aztecs, they have, I suppose you might call it mossy elms or something, whatever they have another name. But we used to call them on PDX. We discovered these things and we first published them, and we called them edge relaxation phenomena, right? And everybody thought elm sounded much nicer than ERP, so we didn't get to name it. But anyway, yeah. So mossy
ERPs are more accurate, I think, than edge localized mode. But anyway.
Right, yeah. The point, yeah, it's an edge relaxation phenomenon. But anyway, the gist of it is that yes, it's clear that you can sustain, not bad H modes. Although what's curiously happening in some of these regimes is you're damaging the pedestal, and somehow by adding impurities or something, the core gets a little better relative to the pedestal. The pedestal goes down, but the core compared to the pedestal goes up some. And so you don't lose so much on global confinement. They're pretty collisional, those regimes, and whether Aztecs could ever get into some of those regimes, I don't know. At least the Aztec continuous exhaust mode is pretty collisional at the edge, as we know are the grassy elms typically.
But
so
then
maybe you can't get there.
Isn't that maybe the way to go? In other words, if you can broaden the layer and you don't lose so much of confinement, isn't that exactly what you need?
If we built Rabu's eater, for sure, where there was lots of confinement margin, but we don't have a ton of confinement margin, so that's an issue.
It's interesting these days that many people are coming back to Rabu's eater. It's quite amusing. So
on the other hand, Rabu's eater's disruptions would,
probably
would have caused buildings to fall down in Kadarash.
Oh. All right, Yannick.
Yeah, thanks. Very stimulating talk. Thanks. Well, in the sheath limited model, then the E cross B shear is related to the temperature gradient via plasma wall interaction.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering whether it is still the case in the detached plasma, where each is plant. What would be the way to get an idea of the E cross B shear in this case to apply the model?
Okay, so essentially you'd be saying T target is 0 in this slide, so there is a 0.71 times T upstream minus T target that comes in if you assume J parallel is 0, and so you want the what would you call it, the electric field driven current to cancel the thermoelectric current. That's where the 0.71 comes from. But the thermoelectric current doesn't just depend on grad T, it also depends on grad N. And that's where this log 2 of log F sub target over log of F sub target comes in. And furthermore, assuming J parallel is 0 is experimentally justified at high densities, is not justified, just flat out not justified at low densities. And people see this. People see, well, Aztec sees a net current from the I'd have to think about it to get the direction, but a net current between the inner and the outer diverter plates. And I did work with the compass team, and we saw that that there were net currents, in this very low density, of course, scrape off layer. There were net currents flowing in the limiter. And so at low densities, this J parallel equals 0 isn't so good. At high densities, it's probably okay, but now you still have the problem that you need a profile for the density. You need to assume some profile for the density. You want pressure balance, you have the temperature, but you still have a game you can play on the density. And so that's where that second term comes from. I should play with it. I mean, one thing I'd like to do is look at how good this expression is from Sangbi and Chankin in a bunch of different Sol PS runs, and see what there's obviously bootstrap currents and other things floating around that it would be interesting to look at with the drifts on in Sol PS. But this is what we have, what I've been using, and so you certainly will get a shearing, and in the worst case it's just 0.7 times T upstream instead of 3 times T upstream. But if T upstream equals T target, you get 3 times T upstream. If T target is 0, you get 0.71 times T upstream plus that other factor. And that factor gets very big if FT gets big. If the upstream temperature divided by the downstream temperature gets big. Actually, no, I guess it gets small. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Anyone else? Anything else? Going once, twice, 3 times. Let's thank Rob again for an extremely interesting talk and stimulating, I think, is a topic that the theorists need to think harder about, and not just gamma linear and all that equals gamma E cross B. There's a lot of good stuff here to do. So
Yep.
Great.
Great, thank you. It was fun talking with you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Cheers.